two new cards have been revealed, including a totally bonkers 10 mana spell for Druid and a 1-drop people seem to be really, really excited about.
Hey, buddy, watch this.
Yeah, so it's 5 a.m. I'm still wearing the same clothes as yesterday. These cards sort of leaked, but not really. They got released in some Chinese press videos, so we know they're real. What we don't know is the exact translations for the names, but the effects, the mana cost, the rarity, and certainly the artwork on these should line up with reality. There might be a little tweak here or there to the way the text is phrased, but certainly the effects, the stats, and all that we know is real. So I felt comfortable running with these cards. Just keep in mind the names might change. So up first here is Natural Selection, as we're calling it now, a 10 mana Druid spell, and it gives all minions in your hand, deck, and battlefield +4/+4. So this is like the uber Keleseth buff that you never wanted. And not only does it buff your deck, but also it's a giant hand buff and it's a giant board buff as well. So this card's kind of hard to break down and figure out exactly what it's all about. When I look at this at a very high level, I say, okay, 10 mana spells are really hard to use. This one is not particularly defensive. It's not a board clear. Even like Ultimate Infestation, right? It had removal and it had armor gain. So you could kind of afford to spend 10 mana on it and you weren't going to just like fall super far behind. And it's resource reload, of course, all those things. So as a 10 mana spell, it felt like it was safe. This 10 mana spell doesn't really feel as safe, right? Because if you play this, you may not really be impacting the board. You could if you had a few minions on board already, but that means you're already kind of ahead. But if you're playing from behind, how do you ever get a spell like this off? Certainly, if the game is going to stretch on for another 5 or 10 turns, this is totally bonkers because every minion you play is going to be absolutely enormous. And like clearly in a control kind of matchup, if you're grinding out a late game with lots of minions, this is going to be an absolute boss card that carries you to victory. There's no question about that. But in any other scenario, if you're playing against a fast deck, do you have time to play this, right? If you're playing against a combo deck, do you have time to play this? And it's going to be really hard to squeeze it in as a 10 mana card. Now, that said, of course, as we know in Hearthstone today, especially in Druid, 10 mana isn't really 10 mana, right? So there's a couple paths to making this cheaper or come down earlier in the game. I think first and foremost is a card like Kael'thas, who can move this to 0 mana. You just play a couple 0 mana spells and boom, your natural selection costs 0. So maybe you run this in a spell druid variation that brings Kael'thas back into the fold. The only downside there, of course, is that a spell druid runs a lot of spells and not as many minions. So the buff doesn't really stretch as far. So how do you build a deck that runs enough cheap spells for Kael'thas or maybe Exotic Mount Seller, but also retains, more than like 4 or 5 minions so that this buff actually has some upside later in the game? And things like, Ysera portals don't count. Those are portals in your deck. They're not minions. So, that's a little bit tricky, but maybe there's a world where you run enough spells or at least enough 0 mana spells, get some Bog Beams, Iron Barks, some cheap stuff in there, and Moonfires and Innervates and the new Innervate card. And this could work as long as you have like 15, maybe even 20 minions are possible. But if you don't hit that Kael'thas, suddenly it's like, oh, how do I play this natural selection again? The alternative is ramp. You've just got so much ramp in Druid. This is really coming down on like turn 6. And if you can play this, even if you're spending 10 mana, right? If you can play this with a minion on board, or even if you just like have enough recovery, you think, or you can build this into a bunch of winged guardians and, just playing one winged guardian is going to stabilize the game. So kind of passing a turn isn't a big deal. Then maybe natural selection could be squeezed out that way as well. But I think that's the thing. You really do have to squeeze it out. It's going to have to be something that you kind of hate to play, but you just got to pull the trigger on it and hope to stabilize later and just grind out people later. So, taunt minions could help you do that. Big rushes. I mean, if there was like a lifesteal minion getting buffed, certainly that could help you regain some life. Imagine this in like a Ziliax world of old, for instance. So how do you recover? How do you stabilize? If you can't do those things, you can't build a deck that satisfies those conditions, I think this card's really limited. But here's the deal. This card has so much ridiculous upside because of its universality of its buff that even though I don't see the path right now, I know that broken things like this in Hearthstone tend to make impacts and people tend to find ways to use these. So I still have a fair bit of hope for this card. I don't think it's likely. I don't think it's consistent, but the sky is the limit for this one potentially. And that kind of scares me, and I think it'll be good. Not to mention, of course, Yogg's Puzzle Box, random generating effects. It's going to be an important card in Hearthstone, even if it's not run in decks. So next up here, we have the Feisty Broomstick. This is a 1-mana 1/1 neutral card. Again, the name here, not guaranteed. A lot of people are calling it the animated broom. I thought it was a little cooler to name it the Feisty Broomstick. This has Rush and Battle Cry, give your other minions Rush. So essentially, kind of a Goblin Lackey adjacent card here. But with way more upside because you can hit 3 or 4 minions. It has Rush itself. It doesn't have attack, of course, but clearly a card or sort of like the Rocket Og Merchant as well. It gives a single minion Rush as a 1-mana 2/1 after dealing damage to it. So, compared to its peers, the Feisty Broomstick definitely looks more powerful. Like, it does way better things and way more things than either of those things, either Goblin Lackey or Rocket Og Merchant. So, yeah, I mean, I can see why people are super excited about this one. A lot of people saying this card's like crazy strong, it's super OP, and it does do a lot. But I think you knew that one's coming. But I have concerns because rarely in Hearthstone these days do we see these like 1-drops that do something getting played. If you look at Rocket Og Merchant, or if you look at like Guardian Og Merchant, another card people were super hyped about, it's really hard to play a follow-up 1-drop. Abusive Sergeant back in the day broke that mold, but once it got nerfed, it no longer does. So, essentially, you want your 1-drops to be proactive minions you play on turn 1. You want their stats to matter more than like some sort of follow-up effect. And the reason for that is because later in the game, when you're following up, when you're playing a secondary thing, you play a minion and then you do something to it, you need the impact to be pretty substantial, right? And 1-mana cards usually aren't just that substantial. So 1-drops tend to favor stats, and they tend to favor sort of acceleration, things that grow or scale, or things that just have stats, Blazing Battle Mages, Argent Squires of old. You want to get a building block to help you trade into early boards. Dire Mole, another great example. And 1-drops that don't do that, 1-drops that don't help you establish an early presence, don't usually get played. If you look at Hearthstone right now, there's not a lot of those follow-up 1-drops. Rocket Og Merchant doesn't get played. Guardian Og Merchant doesn't get played. Abusive Sergeant doesn't really get played, except maybe occasionally in Zoo. And what that means is, I think Feisty Broomstick, despite being, notably better and more powerful, I still don't know if it crosses that threshold where it's good enough as a follow-up 1-drop. Now, obviously, Goblin Lackey is a card that makes a huge impact in the meta. There's no question about that. But you don't have to run it in your deck, right? It's not something you're drawing. It's something you're generating. So it kind of feels like a freebie, whereas this occupies a slot that could be something else. It's a draw that could be something more impactful. Drawing this on turn 8, is it really going to be good enough? I don't know. Maybe if you can do enough alongside it, it's probably actually really like the turn 3 or 4 where this just feels like, it's not doing anything. I'm giving 1 minion Rush and it's a 1/1. It's like, I don't know if it gets there. Now, it does have a higher chance than Rocket Og Merchant. I would argue even more than Guardian Og Merchant. I think it does more and it's better and it has Rush itself. So I'm more hopeful for it than those other cards. I'm not saying this card's like terrible. No one's ever going to play this. I'm saying maybe pull down a little bit on the excitement because I don't know what decks are making room for this. I can see maybe a deck that runs a lot of lackeys, just giving all those Rush and playing off that. I could see maybe a Zoo style deck in the kind of Magic Carpet vibe of old where you're trying to push a lot of minions into trades to stabilize a board on Zoo with like value trades and stuff. But, in Highlander decks, certainly in control decks, I don't think you have enough minions for something like this to work. So, there's a couple paths, but most decks are going to exclude this pretty quickly. So at the end of the day, what I'm saying is it's probably more playable than most follow-up 1-drops. It's probably a totally fine card. I do not think it's as powerful as a lot of the sort of sentiments I'm seeing so far. Just a good card, not an amazing one. Natural Selection is a 3-star card. Feisty Broomstick is a 3-star card. So there you go, folks. That wraps it up for this review. Only 2 cards. I hate doing these smaller videos, but the cards are trickling out all weird. I wish I'd waited and put these in with the last 2 cards, but that's where we're at. So Share your thoughts on these cards. Did I overrate them, underrate them? Are they insanely broken? Are they going to ruin the game? Or is it never going to fit in a deck? Let me know what you think, what decks you'd like to see these run in, how you're planning to break these cards and ruin the meta. Share those thoughts in the comment below. If you enjoyed this video, always appreciate subscribe. So I'm not gonna ask you to like. I don't care if you like it, but I care if you like the video. I don't care if you hit the button, I should say. So, but if you did enjoy it, and you want to see more, a subscribe is pretty nice. That's handy. Trying to get somewhere up there in the 130,000 range. So, thanks for the subscribe if you enjoy it. I'm gonna post a link in the comments. Well, I got a giveaway going. Blizzard gave me some pre-order bundles. I'm going to post about it too later. You'll see more, but I'm going to pin it in the comments. Check that out if you're curious about winning a standard bundle. But in the meantime, thanks so much for watching, and until next time, game on.